As what is relative and historically specific, culture inevitably implies its counterpart, biology, as the domain of the irreducible, the universal. The analytical poverty of this distinction becomes especially apparent when we turn our attention to anthropological studies where the focus is on children. Now, the next section is called Innate Modularity versus Neuroconstructive Development. Trust me, you will understand. Anthropology's objective is to explain the extraordinary multiplicity that is human being in the world, or, more exactly, how the uniqueness that is peculiar to every one of us is located in what we have in common. Does it make sense then to think of a neonate, a newborn baby, as an organism that is born biological only to become cultural as a result of actions performed on it by its caregivers? Surely not. For even in this perspective, the infant's capacity to become the carrier of culture is inherent to it. Thus, culture has to be in some sense given if its particular forms are to be achieved. But if our capacity for culture is biologically given, and if all biological ideas are just as much historical artifacts as any other idea, it follows that the biological and the cultural are aspects of one another. So why retain the distinction at all? Now, we cannot yet track the precise co-ontogeny of neurological processes and conceptual processes, though there are, for example, studies in the developing field of neurophenomenology that are relevant. What we can do with some fair degree of validity is theorize the process in which ideas are constituted over time, their ontogeny from birth onwards. Now, as we shall see, how we characterize ontogeny is crucial to our understanding of the historical specificity of what it is to be human at any time, in any place. Now, from birth, babies are immersed in relations with caregivers. Indeed, newborn babies show capacities which have the effect of facilitating social relationships and which, through functioning, become ever more highly differentiated, or in other words, developed. Not all the early capacities of infants implicate social relations, but even so, the very high salience of other humans for babies is apparent. Thus, over the past 2 decades or so, we have come to know that newborn babies prefer face-like stimuli to other attractive visual stimuli, can discriminate and imitate certain facial gestures of others, show categorical perception of speech sounds, discriminate between curved and straight geometrical shapes, discriminate linguistic input from other auditory inputs, and at 4 days have learned enough to differentiate their native language from others. At 3 months, they show surprise if 2 solid objects seem to occupy the same space. At 4 months, they show surprise if a solid object seems to have passed through a solid surface. At this age, they also show complex cross-modal perception, matching speech sounds to lip movements on the faces that produce them. At 6 months, they show talker normalization, recognizing as equivalent different speech sounds from different talkers. They are also able to make matches in numerosity between sounds and sights. These examples were drawn more or less verbatim from Ellman et al. By 6 months, infants follow people's gaze and attend to objects on which people have acted. By 9 months, infants reproduce other people's actions on objects, and they communicate about objects with gestures such as pointing. That's from Spelke. Now, these demonstrable abilities of neonates and infants have given rise to the idea, now apparently taken for granted by cognitivists of various persuasions, that mind is innately modular, made up of a set of cognitive systems that evolved to deal with separate domains of our environment, and that, consequently, all humans have in common. Cognitive science is a catch-all that takes in congruent models from a number of subdisciplinary domains, principally evolutionary psychology, cognitive anthropology, neuroscience, and cognitive and developmental psychology. What they have in common is a reliance on analytical distinctions between biology and culture, and for many, if not for most, the idea that mind is modular. The modularity idea was first proposed by Fodor, who argued for a limited number of innate perceptual and linguistic input systems, whose outputs fed into central cognitive systems, which functioned to integrate the information into more complex problem-solving forms of central cognition. The input system as cognitive module idea was taken up and elaborated by evolutionary psychologists Tooby and Cosmides, whose massive modularity model became foundational for anthropologists Sperber and Hirschfeld, among others. Now, in the massively modular model, mind is made up of cognitive systems that are pre-wired, that is to say, innate, and domain-specific. Only a subset of them have to do with what is called social cognition. Note, however, that, quote, the domain of a module is not a property of its internal structure, whether described in neurological or in computational terms, but of the mode of construal for which the internal structure provides. Now, this means that a given mode of construal may be brought to bear on entirely novel conditions of the environment, provided they are amenable, as it were, to being so construed. And Sperber finds support from evolutionary psychologists to argue that, quote, a cognitive module is an evolved mechanism with a distinct phylogenetic history, unquote. Massive modularity underwrites Sperber's information processing model of brain function and provides for his idea of an epidemiology of representations as the key to understanding culture. Now, this argument has a bearing on the extensive literature that offers us cognitive explanations of religious beliefs. The module as mode of construal idea provides, for example, for the way that modularity theory may be used to explain religion as the inevitable projection of human consciousness into cosmological ideas concerning an afterlife or the existence of gods. Researchers into cognition of religion, by and large, have in common with Sperber the view that transmission of ideas itself constitutes a problem, though they differ as to their commitment as to massive modularity. They all argue, however, that the commonalities to be found in ideas about gods, ancestors, the supernatural, and so on, can only be a function of invariant features of human cognitive architecture. That is to say, those that are hardwired. They include a theory of mind module, a module that looks for and correctly recognizes agency, a living things module, a module that stipulates the physical properties of objects. Now, indeed, Sperber's massive modularity argument requires that, quote, to an important extent, cognition enables culture through domain-specific constructive mechanisms, unquote. Nothing else, he argues, can explain cultural stability. There is, however, a major problem here, and it has to do with the fact that the models of evolutionary psychologists and their cognitivist followers maintain a distinction between matter and information that does not make biological sense. Now, here I am at one with Evan Thompson, who sums up the problem as follows, quote, "The deepest fault of the metaphor of DNA as program or information store is that it implies a dualist framework of matter and information, one homologous to the computationalist and functionalist dualism of the mind as information software and the brain as hardware. In both cases, processes that are intrinsically dynamic, temporally orchestrated, embodied, that is somatic and organismic, and embedded, necessarily situated in an environment or milieu, whether of ontogeny, evolution, or cognition, are projected into the reified abstractions of a genetic program in the cell nucleus or a computer program in the brain," unquote. That's from Thompson, 2007. An information processing model of mind is bound to retain distinctions between hardware and software, the universal and the relative, the individual and the social, the natural and the cultural. These distinctions are important to cognitivists. They provide for the idea that human biology is the domain of what is universal in human nature, and that culture is the domain of what is relative. The anthropologist's or sociologist's job, then, is to interpret people's cultural representations of the world, their folk theories. This leaves explanation, science, in possession of the domain of what is natural and universal. The modularity of mind theory is a case in point. If only a certain subset of human knowledge can be properly described as social or cultural, this implicitly isolates from contamination other knowledge processes, perception, for example, thus providing for a claim to an objective science of mind. Now, this model is unconvincing because it does not allow for the fact that literally every aspect of human being, including all perceptual processes, can be shown to evince a person's history. Now, there is indeed no necessity for holding to an unwieldy theory of innate, massive modularity. We might, however, want to take the neuroconstructivist approach to child development proposed by the psychologist Carmeloff Smith and her biological connectionist colleagues, who hold that development itself is the key to understanding how cognitive processes become structured in specific ways. Quote is from Carmeloff Smith. "A mechanism starts out as somewhat more relevant to one kind of input over others, but it is usable for other types of processing too. This allows for compensatory processing and makes development channeled, but far less predetermined than the nativist view. Once a domain-relevant mechanism is repeatedly used to process a certain type of input, it becomes domain-specific as a result of its developmental history," unquote. Now, insofar as neuroconstructivists accept the idea of innate modules, these can be nothing more than minimally specified transformational structures. Cognitive development is understood, quote, in terms of self-organizing emergent structures arising from the complex interactions between both organism and environment, unquote. Moreover, the careful experimental work that justifies the model comes to grips with the dynamism of organism and environment. Various problems remain, however. primarily that, like Sperber's, the neuroconstructivist model is founded in a representationalist theory of the mind/brain, and concomitantly in an idea of the person in which sociality is just one among numerous emergent developmental structures, rather than inherent in every aspect of human being in the world. It follows that there is no awareness here that development is an historical process, that is to say, one that is embedded in historically constituted intersubjectivity. The experimental procedures used to elicit neonates' and infants' abilities, while wonderfully convincing, tend, as do all laboratory procedures, to divert attention from the real-world conditions in which the child acquires his or her abilities. The neonate and infant is at any given point immersed in manifold sensations, from skin surfaces, internal organs, visceral sensations of hunger and thirst, warmth and cold, the movements of its own limbs, the different sensory modalities, and so on and so on. Moreover, these manifold sensations are like as not embedded in the waking infant's experience of being held, fed, dressed and undressed, played with, talked to, bathed, carried, caressed, etc., by mother and other caretakers. Now, it seems important to stress here the infant's whole-bodied immersion from birth, and even it might be argued before birth, in specific social relations. The sounds, sights, and touches of others that produce comfort or discomfort, satisfy or withhold, comfort or soothe. These are lived aspects of a specific environing world. And this very observation makes evident the necessity, I've lost that sentence. This very observation makes evident the necessity for rendering developmental history more complete by incorporating into it an analysis of the specific social relations by which it is informed and in which it inheres. For all its focus on development, the neuroconstructivist model rests on an historically specific idea of the child that takes it for granted that what is social in the child's makeup can by and large be differentiated from what is psychobiological. Thus, the neuroconstructivist model is not an adequate model of development because it does not address how intersubjectivity informs development. It remains an artifact of experimental procedures and connectionist modeling. Nevertheless, in the neuroconstructivist models, our schemes of thought and action are self-regulating, transformational, characterized by continuing differentiation through functioning. Conscious phenomena are the artifacts of this autopoietic developmental process. And as the dynamic product of any given human's intersubjective engagement in the environing world of people and things, cognitive processes that evince themselves early on in ontogeny are bound to look like modules. In other words, domain-specific, fast, informationally encapsulated, mandatory. Okay, the next section is called Human Sociality and Theory of Mind. Now, my concern to come to grips with the historical actuality of human beings is in part derived from the nature of anthropology as a discipline. Not only does it engage the long history of differentiation that has given rise to the contemporary variety of languages, kinship systems, political economies, cosmologies, and so on, but also we anthropologists are not allowed to forget our past. There is no inbuilt historical amnesia in the discipline. This is because wherever you do your fieldwork, if you are to attain any decent understanding of the people you work with, you have to read all the work done by those who preceded you in that geographical region, and if archives exist, those too. The more field work you do and the more history and ethnography you read on your region, the more you become aware that history is a dynamic process that continues feeding forward into the transforming present, and that this process must lie at the heart of what it is to be human. It follows that, in one way or another, anthropologists and many a sociologist has to come to grips in their ethnographies with the fact that everything about humans evinces their history. Now, this awareness is still held in check, however, by what appears to be an unwillingness to subject ourselves as scientists to the scrutiny we bring to bear on others. Rather, we see the heralding of a new scientific domain. Quote, this is a quote from Enfield and Levinson, 2010. The roots or foundations of human sociality is proposed as a coherent subject for investigation, constituted by intersecting principles of different orders, ethological, psychological, sociological, and cultural, that work together to produce an emergent system, a system of human sociality and social interaction, unquote. Now, the emphasis here is on bringing together findings from evolutionary and developmental psychology, linguistics, cognitive science, and anthropology. The analytical premises underlying the proposed new synthesis remain, however, undisturbed. Principally, the distinction between biology and culture, the universal and the relative, and often enough, a concomitant dependence on modularity that makes it possible to distinguish social cognition from other forms of cognition. Sociality is central to an argument that provides for intersubjectivity, quote, enabling a brand of joint action that is truly open-ended in goals and structure, and provides the building blocks for human cultural diversity, unquote. A pity, then, that for Enfield and Levinson, the capacity for intersubjectivity rests on the idea of a more or less innate theory of mind, T-O-M. T for theory, O for of, M for mind, Tom. As currently understood, theory of mind is a domain-specific cognitive module whose component parts are concepts about mental states. It functions to understand what others have in mind and to predict what they are going to do. Given its association with rationalism and hypothesis testing, the use of the word theory here is instructive. Thus, the theory of mind module is characterized as open to reorganization in the face of disconfirming evidence. The idea of a theory of mind module has proved persuasive to anthropologists who have used it to argue for an idea of human nature in which people's apparently tacit understandings are effectively privileged by the researcher over their declared ideas. Now, even so, those who make use of the idea vary in their commitment to its being innate, hardwired in the sense of being well specified at birth, though they all consider it to be at least a constraining influence on development. Thus, an intermediate position is taken by Astuti et al., who argue for what they call, quote, the constrained conceptual construction hypothesis, unquote.